The 1984 comedy classic Ghostbusters opens with a scene featuring Bill Murray's character, Peter Venkeman, conducting an experiment to test psychic powers at New York's Columbia University. While this scene is played for laughs, it holds a factual background, as the CIA began experimenting with psychic warfare and espionage techniques through the Stargate Project beginning in the early 1970s at Stanford University. Stanford University and the Central Intelligence Agency would not be the only ones to investigate and test the realms of the human mind and the paranormal, as their inspiration stemmed from the Cold War and Russia's attempts to develop psychic spies. Even members of the private sector would find themselves involved in the testing of psi powers, as can be seen in the experiments that began in 1979 at St. Louis's Washington University. Join us as we look at psychic shenanigans, telekinetic testings, and how these supernatural superpowers are a part of the Show Me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. Show me.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. I'm from Missouri. Show me. Show me.
You're listening to the Show Me podcast with your host, Chris Cowan.
I'm from Missouri. Show me. Show me. Show me.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. You have got to show me.
Highly successful and respected businessmen are not the type of individuals that are usually thought of when picturing psychic investigators. But James McDonald, founder of McDonnell Douglas, would shatter that notion. He held a bachelor's in physics from Princeton and a master's in aeronautical engineering from MIT, and his company built many aircraft of both civilian and military nature. He was a defense contractor in business with the United States military. Hardly the type of person you would imagine to be interested in psychic phenomena. But he was, and he was willing to use his own wealth to pursue those interests and beliefs. McDonald was a firm believer, but he also wanted proof. So throughout the 1970s, McDonald gave grants to various groups who investigated claims of the supernatural, hoping to find and develop the proof that he wanted. In 1979, Washington University would receive one of these grants, valued at $500,000, to construct the McDonald Laboratory for Psychical Research. The laboratory, commonly referred to as MacLab, was headed by physics professor Peter R. Phillips, another firm believer in the paranormal with a decade of parapsychology investigations and interests behind him. Phillips had told the press that MacLab's primary goal was to research PKMB, psychokinetic metal bending abilities, in children. In simpler terms, he wanted to see if children could bend metal with nothing other than their minds. Metal such as spoons, and spoon bending was at the forefront of PKMB. After all, Uri Geller had made a name for himself at Stanford, and later on TV, bending spoons in this same time period, going so far as to appearing as a guest on Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. MacLab advertised through various media outlets about their plans and sought applicants who would be willing to go through the McDonald Laboratory experiments. They would receive roughly 300 applications and ultimately whittle down those numbers to 2 individuals. 17-year-old Michael Edwards, a student from Marion, Iowa, and 18-year-old Steve Shaw, an English immigrant from Washington, Pennsylvania. At Washington University's Mac Lab, Edwards and Shaw would be given objectives such as bending spoons. Lab technicians took numerous measurements of the spoons used in the experiments, labeling each before they exposed the spoons to Shaw and Edwards. They then filmed the men as they conducted their experiments, measuring the spoons afterwards, and finding that the measurements had changed. The spoons had been bent through nothing more than the apparent mental powers of the two boys. The boys were able to repeatedly bend not just similar spoons, but also keys and other metal items. Peter Phillips, the director of Mac Lab, was ecstatic. His laboratory was beginning to gain scientific evidence of psychic phenomena. Phillips and the others conducting experiments at Mac Lab were certainly impressed, but they wanted to see what other powers Shaw and Edwards had locked away in the mysterious recesses of the boys' minds, so they extended their testing with other experiments. One of these involved a photograph that was placed inside an envelope that was stapled shut, and the boys were asked to identify the image sealed inside out of a large cache of potential images. Much to the amazement of the scientists, Shaw and Edwards selected the correct images time and time again, displaying a tremendous amount of psychic intuition. There were other experiments that followed as well. The boys were repeatedly able to cause fuses to blow out, and Shaw had displayed an ability to look into a video camera and cause the image to bloom rapidly in light. Perhaps one of the most interesting of these experiments involved a small paper wheel, placed atop a stem and covered in a glass dome. The two boys were asked to spin the wheel with their mental prowess. Edwards initially had trouble with this experiment, but Shaw began to make his wheel slowly spin. When asked to make it spin in the opposite direction, his wheel began to slow, stop, and then spin again in the desired direction, all within the confines of the McDonald laboratory. Being drained of energy, the boys took a break, drank some sodas, and after relaxing for a brief while, returned to the experiment fully charged, and both boys were able to then move their respective wheels. The psychic powers of the two young men seemed to not only be real, but possibly be growing as further testing was conducted. When objects were placed in a locked aquarium in a locked room overnight, Mac Lab personnel would discover that the objects inside were moved, bent, twisted into unusual shapes, or broken altogether. Only Phillips had the key to the aquarium and the room, which he kept chained around his neck, leaving little question as to the security of the experiment. With each experiment, the personnel of Mac Lab found themselves ever supportive and believing in the powers of both Edwards and Shaw. They had documented evidence of the ability of these two young men and were gaining hard scientific evidence of an actual supernatural power. After 3 years of these tests, the scientists at Mac Lab believed that they were on the verge of academic fame, having proved the validity of psychic abilities in certain people. Phillips was ecstatic and was going to showcase a video of the experiments as proof at a convention for the Parapsychology Association. The video convinced some of those attending that the powers mentioned must certainly be genuine, while others who watched the video felt that the controls and the parameters of the experiments were lax and should be stricter. Perhaps a bit rejected by the latter view, Phillips returned to Washington University's Mac Lab and tightened the areas felt lacking by those at the convention. With these new controls in place, the boys found themselves having a harder time achieving results in various tests. Sure, they were still having success, but not as regularly, not by a long shot. Stage magician James the Amazing Randy would congratulate Phillips on his strengthening of the controls by presenting him an award. Randy was a vocal and adamant skeptic of the paranormal, and after years of criticizing Uri Geller, he began awarding the Bent Spoon Award to those he felt lacked proper scientific principles in their pursuit of proof of the paranormal. Randy would alter this award for Phillips, giving him the Straight Spoon Award. Shaw and Edwards, though young and having a harder time in their lab tests, were beginning to achieve a high level of fame in the world of the weird. With fame came rumors, and Shaw was accused in the Skeptical Inquirer of being a fraud, something that those at MacLab found to be hysterical and out-and-out false. Shaw and Edwards had demonstrated their supernatural mental abilities and had done so in a scientific environment. Their powers were becoming well known, and the two young men were achieving certain levels of fame for the powers that they possessed. So what happened? What became of the experiments, and why aren't these abilities widely accepted in the world we live in? The answer to these questions can best be summed up from a statement that the boys made in a press conference led by the amazing Randy for Discovery magazine in January of 1983. The statement consists of two simple words. We cheated. We cheated. The entirety of the MacLab experiments had been tainted from the start, and lax controls and procedures with Phillips and the others who conducted the experiments allowed Shaw and Edwards to manipulate the data for their benefit. The initial search for participants, the search that saw 300 applicants, ended up picking two men who held an interest in magic tricks. Furthermore, these two individuals had already been in written correspondence with James Randi before the call for applications even went out. Michael Edwards had performed magic tricks for classmates and was well known in his hometown of Marion, Iowa. Steve Shaw held a similar reputation in Washington, Pennsylvania, performing magic tricks, especially those in the genre of mentalism, and had even faked being psychic once as a joke with fellow classmates. Steve Shaw was so skilled as a stage magician that he ultimately made a career of it using the stage name of Banachek. Before the experiments had even begun, James Randi wrote to Phillips, listing certain bullet points that should be followed during the experiments to prevent the results from being contaminated. Randi, a diehard skeptic of the paranormal, suggested bringing in stage magicians to observe the experiments and display ways that those conducting the experiments may be deceived. The amazing Randi had already made a name for himself debunking and exposing the fraudulent faith healer Peter Popoff and having a heated and prolonged duel with Uri Geller, not to mention a successful career of his own performing magic on the stage and on TV, and he even offered to volunteer to review the experiments at no charge to search for any signs of trickery. His offer was never accepted. Randi also met with Shaw and Edwards and told them that if they were ever asked if they were being deceptive or performing magic tricks, they were to state that they were working with Randi and it was all an act. They were never asked. Shaw and Edwards found themselves able to deceive the scientists conducting the experiments as well as those observing them. Knowing that the experiments were filmed, the first attempts were almost always failed, and as the footage was able to be reviewed by anyone at MacLab, the boys simply watched the footage to see what all could be picked up by the camera. With this knowledge, they would succeed the rest of the tests, hiding their activity from the camera's lens. An example of this can be seen in the early spoon bending tests, where the boys would use basic sleight of hand techniques to switch labels tied onto the spoons with those of spoons that had already been physically bent, establishing the belief that these scientifically measured and documented spoons had been mentally bent with supernatural abilities. This simple sleight of hand was also used to swap out blown fuses with the fuses that the boys were asked to blow with their mental powers, making believers of those at MacLab. When asked to identify a photograph that was sealed in a stapled envelope, the two young men simply bent the staples, opened the envelope, and looked inside. They then reinserted the staples into their holes, bent them back into shape, and described the photograph in perfect detail. When Shaw figured out a way to slip a small aluminum ball under the edge of his glass dome and manipulate the paper wheel, he was doing nothing more but gently blowing in the ever so small gap that now existed between the dome and its base. And what about those bright bursts that Shaw made appear on film? He simply reached towards the camera and briefly adjusted a setting, causing the image to distort. As for the sealed case in the locked room, the boys had simply left a window unlocked, climbed in that night, picked the locks of the case, and then wreaked havoc however they desired on the objects within. The results of all these experiments had been nothing more but simple parlor tricks conducted by skilled magicians who had honed their talents to the point of being incredibly convincing, especially to the scientists who, by all accounts, held a bias leaning towards belief in the paranormal. The secret was out, and the deception revealed. Those who had believed in the powers of the boys' minds found themselves, and MacLab, disgraced and humiliated. MacLab personnel had heard the rumors that the boys were frauds before they announced it themselves, but they had laughed it off, believing it to be a joke, perhaps one born out of jealousy by competitors in the psychic world. But alas, the rumors had been true, and James, the amazing Randy, had been behind it all, in cahoots with Shaw and Edwards the entire time. Project Alpha was, and still raises ethical debates about the manner in which the fraud was conducted. As recently as 2011, Michael Thalborn, who was one of the testers at MacLab, published that, quote, James Randi, who sought to discredit MacLab's staff just to prove some vague point. He had two of his poorly trained magicians infiltrate the lab so they could indulge in deceptive practices that included cheating and all manner of fraud. Needless to say, this reprehensible behavior was detected, and no published works ever emerged from Randy's farcical escapade. End quote. However, this quote does not appear accurate to the events from the time. Shaw and Edwards were both skilled magicians. Shaw, or Banachek if you will, has made a career out of his skills. Phillips was incredibly distraught, and if the deceptive practices had actually been caught, there would have been no video exposure at conferences, and Shaw and Edwards would not have gained fame in the paranormal circuit. The fraud also would not have had to have been revealed by Randy, Shaw, and Edward, who felt that the hoax had gone on for too long, with Shaw and Edwards especially feeling guilt over duping MacLab personnel that they had become friends with. Many contemporaries believed that Randy, as Berthold Schwartz stated, set parapsychology back 100 years. Randy believes otherwise, thinking that research into such fields must be held on stricter scientific guidelines and protocols. He also states that many researchers into the field have expressed thanks and praise for the hoax that was Project Alpha, as it was hoped that it would force the field to actually be more scientific. But here we end our tale of phony psychics and make-believe mental powers, stage magicians and scientific shenanigans, MacLab and malarkey, and Project Alpha, and how it all became a part of the Show Me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. Show me.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. I'm from Missouri. Show me. Show me.
This has been a presentation of the Show Me podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, then please leave us a review on iTunes, Google Play, or whichever service you listen with. Contact us at theshowmepodcast.com. Find us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a voicemail at 573-203-8668. This presentation is copyright 2019, The Show Me Podcast. No part of this program may be duplicated or reproduced without the written consent of The Show Me Podcast. Music in this program is Creative Commons Media and is the property of the respective creating entity. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in 2 weeks for another episode of The Show Me.
I'm from Missouri. Show me. Show me. Show me.
I am from Missouri.
Show me. I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. You have got to show me.
Show me. Show me. I'm from Missouri. Show me.
I am from Missouri. You have got